Good morning, students. Now we can study the outbreeding devices. These are called as contrivances. What are these outbreeding devices? There are some plants which prevent self-pollination. They promote cross-pollination and increase genetic diversity. Now these are the special type of adaptations made by the plant. They are called as the outbreeding devices or the contrivances. So there are some plants which protect self-pollination. They promote cross-pollination and increases the genetic diversity. So these are the modifications which are made by the plants now. See here, genetic diversity is an essential factor for evolution. So we know that what is required for the evolution, genetic diversity is related there. So genetic diversity, it is an essential factor for evolution by the natural selection. So we have to study today what are the special type of adaptations made by the plants for the typical type of pollination. Now see here, there are different methods we have to study one by one. Number one is called as unisexibility. See here, uni means one, sexibility means sex or the male, either male or female is present there. So the plant which bears only male or female flower is called as dioecium. What is dioecium? The plant which bears only male or female flower is called as dioecium, and the flower is unisexible, so self-pollination is not possible. So whenever the self-pollination is not possible, we will find that there is only possibility, that is the another type pollen grains, they are necessary. So here unisexibility is also the outbreeding device. There is only one sex, there is only one possibility that there should be only to accept the pollen grain from the outside flower. So this is the special type of contrivance, or we can say the outbreeding device, unisexibility. When the plant has only one male or female flower, it is called as the dioecium, and the flower is unisexible, so self-pollination is not possible. That is also studied that it is also a outbreeding device. Now there is a dichogamy. In this device, anther and stigma matures at a different time. See here, this is also a modification, that the maturation time period between androcium and gynocium, or the male and female, or the anther and stigma, is different in the bisexual flower. Although the flower is bisexual, although the male and female they are present in one flower, but the maturation time is different, so it is not possible, so it prevents the self-pollination. That is also considered as a special type of modification made by the plant for the pollination. We have studied two types, unisexibility, when there is only one sex is present, or we can say the part is present. So whenever flower is, it bears only one male or female part, the possibility is only one, that to take the pollen grain from outside. Now in the dichogamy, the male and female, although they are present in bisexual flower, but the maturation time period is different, so this is also preventing the self-pollination. Now the dichogamy has two types now. One is protandry. Pro means before, andry means androcium. In this type, androcium matures first. Protandry. Pro means before, andry. Who matures first in this type? Androcium matures first, then the gynocium. So that is example, disc florets in the sunflower. We know that in the sunflower two types of flower they are present, the ray florets and disc florets. At the central side you will find there the disc florets, and outer side the colored part is they are the ray florets. So androcium matures first in this type, before the gynoecium, it is called as protandry. Pro means before, andry means androcium. Androcium matures first. And the example is the disc florets. We are studying this one in the dichogamy, whenever the flower is bisexual, but the maturation time is different. Among it, first type is protandry. Pro means before, andry means androcium. Androcium matures first. Example is the disc florets. This is also the modification or the special type of device or contrivance made by the plant for the pollination. Now the another type is called as protogyny. Means gynoecium matures first. Protogyny. Pro means before. Protogyny. Gynoecium matures first. So androcium matures later on, and the possibilities to take the pollen grain from the outside. Example is gloriosa. त्याला आपण मराठीमध्ये कळलावी असं म्हणतो. ग्लोरिओसा सुपरबा. याच्यामध्ये अँड्रोसियमच्या कंपॅरिझनमध्ये गायनोसियम अगोदर मॅच्युअर होतो आणि त्या ठिकाणी एकच शक्यता असते, बाहेरून पोलन ग्रेन पॉलिनेशनसाठी घ्यावे लागतात. नाउ सी हियर the third type. We are going to study here the different types. That is the prepotency. The pollen grains of the flower germinate rapidly than the pollen grains of same flower on the stigma. This is the another type of device or the modification or the adjustment which is made by the plant. So what is this? The pollen grains of other flower germinates rapidly than the pollen grains of same flower on the stigma. त्याच फुलावरचे जेव्हा स्टिग्मावर पोलन ग्रेन पडतात त्यापेक्षा लवकर बाहेरून आलेले पोलन ग्रेन हे लवकर जर्मिनेट होतात. सो दॅट इज द प्रीपोटेन्सी. दिस इज द आउटब्रीडिंग डिवाइस और मॉडिफिकेशन मेड बाय द प्लांट फॉर द वी कॅन सी द आउटसाइड और द क्रॉस पॉलिनेशन. एक्झाम्पल इज ॲपल, ज्याला आपण सफरचंद म्हणतो, त्याच्यामध्ये आपल्याला या प्रकारचं मॉडिफिकेशन मिळतं. वी आर गोइंग टू स्टडी हिअर द different types of outbreeding devices. Unisexibility, dichogamy. In the dichogamy there are two types: protandry, androcium matures first. Example is sunflower. Protogyny, gynoecium mature first. That is example gloriosa, kalalavi. Prepotency, that is the pollen grain of the other flower germinates rapidly than the pollen grains of the same flower. So we will find that here only cross pollination takes place. Example is apple. Then the another type that is called as a hetero style. Hetero means different, style means it having the different length or they are situated at the different level. Heteromorphy, it is also called as the heteromorphy. In the plant like the primrose there are 2 or 3 types of flower. So flowers are how many types? 2 or 3 types. Stigmas and anthers are placed at different level, so the pollen grains cannot reach to the stigma. So the position of the anther and stigma is different, so pollen grain cannot reach to the stigma. So there is only possibility, that is the cross pollination only. Another type that is called as Dichogamy. It is the mechanical device which is useful to prevent the self pollination in bisexual flower. It is the mechanical device which is useful to prevent the self-pollination in the bisexual flower. Now there are some natural physical barriers which is present between the two sex organ, which avoids contact of stigma and pollen grain in some flower. So there are some barriers which can avoid the reaching of the pollen grain towards the stigma. Example is calotropis. Stigma is situated above the anther which prevent self pollination. Stigma is situated above the anther. आपण कॅलोट्रॉपिसच्या मध्ये धोत्र्याच्या मध्ये जर आपण पाहिलं कॅलोट्रॉपिस प्रोसिरा, कॅलोट्रॉपिस जिजान्सिया, त्याच्यामध्ये लेंथ ही डिफरंट आहे. स्टिग्मा ही किंवा फिमेल रिप्रोडक्टिव्ह पार्ट हा अँथरच्या पेक्षा वर सिच्युएटेड केलेला आहे. तेव्हा आपल्याला पॉसिबिलिटी काय आहे की त्या ठिकाणी क्रॉस पॉलिनेशन व्हावं. देन द अनदर टाईप कॉल्ड ॲज इनकम्पॅटिबिलिटी, दॅट इज अ सेल्फ स्टॅबिलिटी. It is a genetic mechanism in which the pollen grains are inhibited to germinate on stigma of the same flower. When the pollen grains they falls on the stigma of the same flower, they cannot germinate, they become sterile. It is called as the self sterility. Example is tobacco. Tobacco is त्याचं example आहे. Now there another bit we have to study today. What we have to study, that is the pollen pistil interaction. What is the pollen pistil interaction? Now it is the interaction of pollen grain with sporophytic tissue, or we can see the stigma. What is pollen pistil interaction? It is the interaction of pollen grains with sporophytic tissue, that is the stigma. It starts with pollination and ends at fertilization. There are different changes takes place between these two reactions, that is the pollination and the fertilization. So what chemicals or enzymes or the required thing is given there, we know that is we have to study in the pollen pistil interaction. Now all the events from deposition of pollen grain on the stigma to entry of pollen tube in the ovule are referred as pollen pistil interaction. What are pollen pistil interaction? All the events from deposition of pollen grain on the stigma to entry of pollen tube in the ovule are referred as pollen pistil interaction. Now stigma cannot allow to grow right type of pollen grain of the same species. जेव्हा तशाच प्रकारच्या किंवा त्याच झाडाचे पोलन ग्रेन हे त्या स्टिग्मावर पडतात तेव्हाच ते जर्मिनेट होतात, नाहीतर ते प्रिव्हेंट केल्या जातात. सो स्टिग्मा कॅनॉट अलाउज टू ग्रो ओनली stigma can allows to grow only right type pollen grain on the same species. Now compatibility and incompatibility can be of the pollen pistil is determined by the special protein. There are special type of proteins which can decide this reaction. In this process, pollen recognition and promotion or inhibition of the pollen grain takes place. By this reaction, or we can see the process, the which type of pollen grain they can germinate or which cannot, they can be decided. The stigmatic surface of flower refuse wrong type of pollen grain. If the pollen grain of different plant enters or falls on the stigma, it is wrong type, so it cannot be germinated there. Now the compatible pollen grain absorbs water and nutrients from the stigma. जो त्या झाडावरचा त्या झाडासारखा किंवा त्या झाडाला अपेक्षित आहे तो पोलन ग्रेन स्टिग्मावर पडल्याच्या नंतर तो तिथलं पाणी आणि त्याला लागणारे पोषक तत्व हे अब्सॉर्ब करतो. इट अब्सॉर्ब फ्रॉम द स्टिग्मा सरफेस and germinates and produces the pollen tube. That is the formation of male gametophyte. When it takes place, when the right type of pollen grain falls on the stigma. Now see here, the pollen tube grows through the style. It is determined by the specific chemicals. The pollen tube ruptures. Now how the entry takes place in the embryo sac? In the embryo sac, we know that there are synergids, and the synergids, when they allows the entry of the pollen tube, then and then only the fertilization or the release of the male gametes takes place. So here some chemicals and chemical reaction, they are responsible to take entry of pollen tube in the embryo sac. Due to the pollen pistil interaction, intense competition develops, can be compatible pollen grain. The gametes which are which we can say the powerful, they can germinate there. It plays important role in sexual reproduction and seed formation. So there are also certain chemical reactions which we know that the chemical reaction, they are responsible for the other process, that if the right type of pollen grain, when it falls on the stigma, then and then only it can absorb the water and nutrient, then the pollen tube is produced, and then the male gametophytes, they are produced, and then entry of pollen tube through the we can say synergies inside the embryo sac takes place and the fertilization takes place. So these all types of reactions are called as the pollen pistil interactions. Now these are too much important. Wrong type of pollen grain cannot germinate there. Thank you.